Welcome to Christian Answers. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyzer. And today we're going to be talking about a documentary that I recently got to watch. I've been wanting to watch this for a number of months. I haven't been able to. Finally, I did. And it's the Grace Community Church, John MacArthur's documentary called Essential Church, and it's basically a description of what took place during the pandemic years when Grace Community Church out in California, I had the privilege of attending that church when I was out studying at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. Often when I would go out there to study, and what I did was I took doctoral classes, seminar format. So you don't have to live out in California, but you can go in to California for 2-week seminars. So when you're there, you have 2 or 3 Sundays where you're able to go visit different churches in the area. So one Sunday, while I was studying at Fuller Seminary in the seminar format doctoral ministry classes, I would go up the street to Panorama City, California, outskirts of LA, and visit John MacArthur's Grace Community Church. So I've been there. I've seen their sanctuary, their services. They have also a seminary and college. So it's quite a complex out there. But what happened during the pandemic of 2020 was that Los Angeles County had this very strict lockdown rules and regulations, and one of the requirements was that all churches had to shut down, could not meet on Sunday, and this was for a long, extended period of time. Well, what happened is that this documentary basically outlines and explains all that happened to Grace Community Church, and it's a long story, and the documentary, I think it's a couple hours long, walks you through actually what happened and the Grace Community Church's fight against LA County's lockdown restrictions. Because it begins at the very beginning, as like everyone, 2020 rolls around and all of a sudden Wuhan, China, and all of a sudden Chinese cities all over their country began to shut down because of a virus, COVID-19. And then it comes to first spreads to Italy and Europe nations, all these deaths occurring, and then it eventually hits the United States, and the government's leaders at every level, national, state, county, they're scrambling to try to figure out, okay, what do we do? How do we respond to this crisis? And one of the unfortunate things that government did was to instigate a lockdown. Now, from the federal level, President Trump, his last term in office, he talked to his advisors. He talked to Anthony Fauci, talked to all kinds of experts, and they advised him to shut down everything for a couple weeks. And we heard this mantra, 15 days to slow the spread. So it started with 15 days. Everything's going to shut down. Businesses are going to shut down. Organizations shut down. Churches shut down. Everything, essentially, just shut down. And so that's how it started. That's how the whole thing started. And then it moved on from there. The problem was that the shutdown, it was not a temporary shutdown. Because what started as a 15 days to slow the spread eventually turned into weeks and months. And there were some churches that actually shut down for close to a year and had no public services. So John MacArthur was just like everybody else in Christianity. We were saying, okay, well, they want us to shut down the churches for a couple weeks, 15 days to slow the spread. And then once we figure out what the real issue is here, we can figure out how long or how short a time to stay closed and then open up hopefully, and I remember the time where, having gone through that, President Trump was saying, well, hopefully on Easter Sunday, we'll be all done with this shutdown. And his goal was to shut down until Easter Sunday, and then on Easter Sunday, it would all open back up. And so little do we know that was naive. But so John MacArthur and Grace Community Church were in the same boat as everybody else. They were trying to figure out what to do. And so they went along. They complied with the lockdown mandates. But then after a while, we began to see, for example, some of these BLM riots and protests. We began to see our public officials say, well, it's okay to go out and protest, and it's okay to be a part of the riots, and it's okay to be a part of the demonstrations because it's for a good cause, social justice, and so on and so forth. And the leaders of Grace Community Church and John MacArthur were beginning to scratch their head and say, well, wait a minute. If this virus is so deadly that we have to shut down church service, then there needs to be a clear understanding of what is the danger. Because if you're going to let people protest, if you're going to let, for example, in Las Vegas, the casinos were open, but the churches were not. And so there's hypocrisy taking place, and there's a credibility problem here. Because, for example, like I mentioned, in Las Vegas, the state was allowing a casino industry to stay open because they labeled that as an essential service. And the same way with many other things in and around the country, that there were certain essential services. The church, they deemed, was not an essential service. So we need to lock it down. We need to shut it down. No worships, no prayers, no preaching on Sunday morning, strictly forbidden. And yet, things that we deemed, the government officials, we deemed essential, we will allow open. And John MacArthur, Grace Community Church, and other pastors began to say, well, wait a minute. You're playing favorites. You're picking and choosing which segments of society will stay open and which segments of society will stay closed. Based on what? And as we also began to learn, this virus was not as deadly as they had at first thought. I remember very distinctly hearing on the internet, television, radio, that the virus affects the young and the old, and it affects those who are at either extremes. Either very young children it affects, and it affects the very older. Well, we know now that that is totally false. It does not affect the young and the old. It affects the old and the infirmed, and it affects those with pre-existing conditions, but it does not affect young people hardly at all. So young children have basically zero risk. Teenagers have basically zero risk. Young adults have basically zero risk, and people who are basically healthy and fit and in shape do not have hardly any risk. It's mostly people who are suffering from some other condition or who are elderly. And we learn that as we go along in looking at the virus. And so MacArthur began to get information about the hypocrisy of the government leaders. He began to get information about the true nature of the virus and the true nature of the threat. And he began to question whether Christian should allow the government to basically dictate when Christians meet and gather and have Sunday worship. Because you also have to consider, and they bring this out in the documentary, that the Bible talks about do not forsake the assembling of yourselves one with another. So we have a mandate from God. We have a command from God. We have instructions from God to hold church services. And we are to obey God rather than man. And so when you put all of these factors together, Grace Community Church and the elders there decided to weigh all of the biblical arguments for having church services against all of the arguments that the state was trying to push as to why churches should not meet. And they basically concluded that it was not permissible for the state to dictate the terms of Christianity, especially because we have a constitution, we have religious liberties. The state cannot impose itself on the church. The church should not impose itself on the state. And there is a separation that should be followed, that the state cannot come in and prohibit worship under the guise of a health emergency, which statistically and data-driven does not conclude that churches cannot worship. And so what happened at Grace Community Church was that they began to open the doors of the church on Sunday morning that was doing what every church was doing, that was basically live streaming the sermon and some of the music. And so John MacArthur, as well as thousands and thousands of pastors across the country, they were essentially preaching to an empty church building on Sunday morning, and it was broadcast live on the internet, and that's what he was doing. But they began to open the doors of the church and not say anything, not invite people to come to the church, but basically just letting the doors open, and people began to trickle in. And after so many weeks, there were a few hundred people there on Sunday morning. And from the pulpit, from the announcements, they didn't make a big deal about it. And then a few thousand people began to trickle in. And pretty soon you basically had a crowded church that was meeting, that technically, legally, according to the LA County law and regulation and mandates, shouldn't be meeting. And so then at that point, then the church leaders and MacArthur actually acknowledged this, says we are now open and we are going to be meeting, and that this virus is not what our officials are telling us. They're making up these arbitrary standards of 6 feet social distancing and wearing masks and all kinds of rules and regulations. And these are total impositions. These do not follow the science. These do not follow evidence-based science. They are simply arbitrary, man-made mandates coming down from a totalitarian government, or at least an attitude of totalitarianism. So they began to essentially break the law according to the LA County mandates. And so this put them in the crosshairs of the lawyers for LA County, and they were sent a cease and desist letter, and they were fined then every Sunday where they disobeyed the law. They were fined. And so the fines began to rack up thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so MacArthur and Grace Community Church, the documentary explains, hired Christian lawyers. Jenna Ellis was one of them. And they were, I think it was the Thomas More Society Association, began to represent them in court. And they began to explain this whole process of what took place. And in the end, the lawyers for John MacArthur and Grace Community Church actually won. And they won their case in court, and LA County dropped all charges and didn't require any more fines. And actually, LA had to pay for all the lawyer fees for John MacArthur and his Grace Community Church in the end. So total vindication of the rightness of their cause. total victory. And it was a greatly encouraging thing for all churches and all pastors, because I remember following that whole scenario and saga. And I remember how after the first few months or so of this lockdown, I began to question myself. I began to say, well, wait a minute, why are these other organizations and companies and movements like Black Lives Matter, why are they allowed to operate as if there were no pandemic? And then churches, they had to be highly strictly regulated, not allowed to meet on Sunday morning, and threatened with fines and jail time for the pastors. Now, the documentary already dealt and covered quite extensively the situation in Canada, which was a lot worse than our country. They had pastors in Canada actually thrown in jail. And there was a pastor named James Coates, I think it was in Edmonton, where he was essentially doing what John MacArthur was doing and saying, no, we're going to continue meeting, and we're just giving the people the information that we know about the virus, and they're making their own decisions. If they suffer from health problems, if they are obese, or if they're elderly, we recommend that they don't come to church because of the risk of COVID-19. But if they're healthy, if they're young, if they don't have any underlying health conditions, then they have to make the decision as to whether they come or not. And if they want to come, then we will welcome them, and we will have church service just as normal and leave it into the hands of the people, whether they want to come or not. So that's what they did, and they held services, and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police came in and eventually shut their church down, changed the locks on the doors, put fencing around their church to prevent anyone from entering, and arrested the pastor and put him in prison. And they did that to a number of churches in Canada where the pastor defied the lockdown mandates and ordinances. So it was a lot more severe in Canada than it was in the United States, and that's mainly because they don't have a constitution that guarantees religious liberties like we do. So this documentary was very, very good in explaining and laying out exactly what was happening during this very confusing, very chaotic time of 2020. And it really did expose pastors and ministries and churches that would just simply roll over and cave in and do whatever the government told them to do. It really exposed those pastors. I think of, for example, when I think of a pastor who basically capitulates to the state and just does whatever he's told to do without any reference to what God might tell his church to do, is Andy Stanley down in Georgia. Andy Stanley's church was essentially closed to live services for about a year, 1 full year. Because Andy Stanley decided that he, instead of being faithful to the Lord and following God's commands in scriptures to meet together, one with another, he would play a marketing PR game where he would do whatever was in the best interest of marketing his church. So in his book, Not In It to Win It, he basically describes, he says, we stayed closed, not because we looked at the evidence and that the people in charge of government were telling us to. We stayed closed because people outside of our church were afraid, and we didn't want to offend them. So he basically took a poll and found out that a lot of people, a lot of non-Christians mostly, were afraid to go to church. And so he said, we're going to stay locked down until people weren't afraid anymore. And so he left it in the hands of people to determine the policy of his church. And I can't think of a more cowardly way to lead a church than that. Instead of going to God and seeing what is most important and totally neglecting the pastoral role. I mean, the pastoral role is you have to please God first and then please people second. And God has already stated that we're not to neglect meeting together with each other in Christian worship and church. We're not to do that. And that means you cannot let the church be empty Sunday after Sunday after Sunday for a whole year just because there are people like Dr. Fauci who say that 6 feet social distancing, wearing a mask, and Fauci even went to the extent of saying you should wear 2 masks because it wouldn't help, or it wouldn't hurt to wear 2 masks. Crazy. Even though the science of masking is not anything that you can point to that would support blocking the COVID-19 virus. So you take all of the information you have, and to say that you should lock your church down for a whole year and have the people not meet and fellowship with one another is just insane. And that's what Andy Stanley did. So you really find out what kind of leaders you have in the church and which ones will follow God and which ones will follow man. So there really was sort of a watershed moment for evangelical Christianity in the country. I think most pastors began to realize that the fears about this virus for the average person were overblown, that there was a power grab on the part of politicians who wanted to exercise their authoritarian control over the population, and this was a great time to do it and test case for later future totalitarian advantages, and so they did it. But I think that most pastors began to realize, hey, this lockdown has to end, and we're going to get back to the normal business of the church. And so you began to see after that spring, and especially into the summer, you began to see pastors saying, hey, we're going to open our church, and we're going to start having people meet together in person, in public. And that's what happened. And so pretty much I would say that most churches by the end of the summer of 2020 were back to meeting, at least to some extent. Basically telling people, if you're healthy, if you're not elderly, if you're not obese, if you don't have underlying conditions, if you don't have a health risk, then weigh it in your own mind and feel free to perfectly come back to church. If you're elderly, if you have health conditions, you might want to stay away. But again, it's up to the individual. And the benefits of holding church are so much. I mean, can you imagine isolating people in the midst of a panic and fear and a pandemic scene? No, that's when people need each other and the encouragement that preaching and praying together and worshiping God together brings. You need that encouragement. And to say that the church is not an essential service is an insult. It's a secular, humanistic, atheistic evaluation of the church. It's not a godly evaluation of the church. So this documentary brings all of that out. And it really is a great example of how we as Christians, we need to really begin to think in terms of the days that are coming ahead. The trend is among governments of the world is to become more and more socialist and totalitarian. The trend is that government becomes bigger and bigger and more controlling, more regulations, more strict rules and mandates. And we can see the writing on the wall as Christians. If we don't assert our right to meet as Christians, if we don't assert the autonomous nature of the church, in other words, the government does not control and dictate the terms of when church meets and how they meet. You should have seen the list, and this was included in the documentary, all the regulations about church meeting. They told John MacArthur and Grace Community Church, yes, you can meet, but you have to do this, a whole big list of all these things. They had hoops they had to jump through. And he basically looked at that and said, if we start submitting to that, we're never going to stop submitting to the government. They're trying to basically control us. So he basically announced to the congregation, he says, there are no rules. You don't have to bring a mask. You don't have to socially distance. You don't have to do any of that. We're going to meet like we've always met. And if you don't feel good about meeting in public with people, if you don't feel safe about doing that, don't come to church. But if you feel safe about it, come to church. We're going to be here. We're going to meet like we always do, just as the Lord has commanded us to do. And so they did that. And that actually won the day, because he feels, and it was described in the documentary, that if he had started to submit to all of their different regulations, then they would have come back with more and more and more. And so he basically did a great service for churches in the United States, which was basically, he went on record as saying, look, we look to you for political and economic leadership, but you cannot intrude into the sphere of church, because that's not your area. You cannot dictate the terms of church. Yes, if there's an emergency, short-term emergency crisis, just like if there were a tornado coming through and the health ministry advised not attending church because of the tornado, or some kind of if there was a war going on and they were bombing that day, stay indoors, blah, 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 whatever. Yeah, short-term emergencies, but long-term lockdowns, no. And so that's a great lesson that Christianity had to learn through this pandemic, and churches need to heed now in the future, because I'm sure there are going to be emergencies come in the future, and we have to be ready to use our own best judgment and say, okay, we're never again going to submit to politicians telling us to close our churches down indefinitely. No. Short term, a couple weeks, initially the 15 days to slow the spread, yes, until we figure this out. But long term, no. That is basically saying the church is ruled by the state. Caesar rules the church. And we know from the Bible that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is King. Jesus is the one we follow, not some president, not some civil authority, not some policy bureaucrat, not even the governor of a state, not the mayor of a city, county executives. No, Jesus is Lord, and we follow him, and we will be willing to defy all earthly powers to be faithful to Jesus Christ. And so it's a good documentary. I highly recommend seeing it. It's called Essential Church, because the church is an essential service, even though the politicians may say it's not. Jesus is Lord, and we follow him. Well, I hope that's been a helpful commentary. We'll see you back next week. God bless.